Hi there. Let your mind slow down and relax your body. We aim to be calm and peaceful. And please, in the comments, write down your best help for sleeping and let me know where you are from. And never forget that you are loved and important in this world to somebody. You are unique and we love you. The woman behind the mirror. The evening was uneventful, just like any other day during our work trip. My coworker Rebecca and I had returned to our hotel after a grueling day in the field. The stale smell of hotel air greeted us as we stepped into the hallway, each of us holding on to the mundane comfort of our room keys. I was exhausted, longing for a hot shower and a bed that smelled faintly of bleach. As we reached our rooms, Rebecca lingered outside hers, chatting with me while I fiddled with my door. The card reader flashed green, and I pushed the door open. A sense of unease washed over me immediately. The bathroom light was on. I hadn't left it that way. The sound of running water wasn't present, nor the faint hum of any typical hotel sounds, but there was movement. The shadow of a figure danced faintly through the frosted glass of the bathroom door. "Hello?" My voice echoed in the empty room. There was no response. A logical explanation surfaced. It must be the cleaning staff finishing up. But then I saw her. A woman emerged, her frame small but her presence jarring. Her hair was wild, her clothes disheveled. In her hands she clutched a bundle of clothing. My clothing. "Excuse me," I yelled, my voice shaky. "What are you doing?" The woman froze, her eyes wide with a mix of guilt and desperation. Rebecca peered into the room, alarm flashing across her face. The intruder began mumbling, her words barely coherent. My key. It still works," she stammered, holding up the key card as if it explained her presence. "It still works. That's how I got in." Her words rattled me. My mind raced to make sense of the situation. The hotel had assured us the rooms were secure, yet here she was, not just trespassing, but mid-robbery. "Put that down," I shouted, pointing to my clothes in her arms. She hesitated, her trembling fingers loosening their grip on the bundle before letting it fall to the floor. Behind me, Rebecca was motionless, her face pale. The woman clutched a white plastic bag and began edging toward the door. "It's my stuff," she insisted, her voice trembling. "Just my things. I'll show you." She opened the bag briefly, revealing its contents, miscellaneous junk that didn't seem to belong to me. For a moment, I felt relief. Maybe she hadn't stolen anything vital. My mistake was letting her leave. The door slammed shut behind her, and a cold silence filled the room. I began surveying the damage. The drawers were open, my clothes tossed about carelessly. My bags were rifled through, and personal items were scattered on the bed. In the bathroom, it was worse. My neatly folded underwear and bikinis were crammed into one of my bags. Even my passport had been unceremoniously shoved in alongside them. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. "Rebecca," I called out, my voice cracking. "She went through my medication." I ran to the hallway, my shoes slapping against the worn carpet as I darted toward the lobby. The woman was gone. I searched frantically in the laundry room, even stepping outside to check the perimeters of the building. But there was no sign of her. Defeated, I returned to my room, where Rebecca waited with a worried expression. The police arrived quickly, questioning us as I tried to recall every detail. One officer began inspecting the room, his flashlight sweeping over the disarray. That's when I noticed it. Small bits of drywall in the sink. "Hey, what's this from?" I asked, pointing it out to the officer. He frowned and looked around. We checked the door frame, the windows, anywhere she might have pried her way in, but nothing was amiss. She must have had a spare key, the officer concluded, though his tone betrayed his uncertainty. Hours later, after the officers had left, I sat on the edge of the bed, replaying everything in my mind. My eyes kept drifting back to the sink. Something about that drywall didn't sit right with me. I stood and approached the bathroom, staring at the mirror above the sink. Slowly, the pieces clicked into place. "Rebecca!" I shouted, adrenaline surging. She rushed in, alarmed. "Help me pull this mirror off the wall," I said. Together we lifted it, exposing what lay behind. My stomach turned. There was a hollow cavity behind the mirror, a space large enough for someone to crawl through. My flashlight revealed a grotesque sight. A pillow, a blanket, cigarette butts, empty cans, and discarded clothing. This woman hadn't just broken into my room. She had been living in the walls. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat as the realization hit me. She had been there the whole time. Every moment I had been in this room, every night I had fallen asleep, she could have been just on the other side of the mirror, watching, waiting. The hotel staff were baffled. They admitted the walls had been under renovation, but hadn't been properly sealed. The woman likely accessed the space through the unfinished section, and had been living there for days, if not weeks. Cigarette smoke I had previously dismissed as coming through the vents was hers. Random chills, creaks, and strange noises. They all made sense now. The thought of her watching me, perhaps even contemplating more than theft, sent shivers down my spine. I packed my belongings within minutes, refusing to spend another second in that room. As we drove away, the darkened hotel loomed in the rearview mirror, its shadows stretching like claws across the parking lot. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the hollow cavity haunted me, and I couldn't shake the question. How many others had she watched from behind the mirror? The unsettling guest. The Midwest Hotel was quiet, nestled in a sleepy town that seemed worlds away from the bustling chaos of cities. I had been working there for a little over a month as a housekeeper, my first real job since graduating high school. The hotel was modest, just 2 floors and about 40 rooms, and most of the guests were traveling workers or families passing through. When I told my parents about the job, they raised their eyebrows. "That place is sketchy," my dad warned. "Be careful." I shrugged it off. The guests seemed polite, if not a bit distant. Nothing about the place felt dangerous. But that was before the man in room 204. It started like any other morning. I clocked in at 10:30 a.m., greeted the front desk manager, and grabbed my cleaning supplies. My first assignment was a set of stayover rooms. Rooms where guests were staying more than one night and only required light tidying. I preferred these because they were faster to clean. I started down the hallway toward the end where the less trafficked rooms were located. The hallway was quiet, except for the faint hum of the vending machine. At the far end of the hall were 4 rooms tucked into a corner, 2 on each side. As I approached, the door to one of them creaked open. A man stepped out, his hulking figure filling the doorway. He looked to be in his mid-40s, standing well over 6 feet tall, with a broad, heavy build that seemed to dwarf my own petite frame. His gray t-shirt clung to him, damp with sweat, and his jeans were frayed at the cuffs. "Hi there," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Do you know how to work the coffee machine in my room?" His size unnerved me, but I forced a polite smile. "Sure, I can show you." He stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. I hesitated, suddenly hyper-aware of how isolated this part of the hotel was. My manager was down the hall in another room, and there wasn't another guest in sight. "I'll grab it for you," I offered instead. I retrieved the machine from his room, showed him how to use it in the hallway, and quickly returned it. He thanked me with a lingering gaze that made my skin crawl. I moved on to the next room, hoping he'd retreat to his own and leave me be. But minutes later, as I was changing the linens, I heard his door open again. His heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, stopping just outside my room. "No need to clean mine," he said. His voice startled me, making me jump. I turned to see him leaning casually against the doorframe, watching me. "Oh," I replied, forcing another smile. "Got it. Thanks for letting me know." He didn't leave. He just stood there, his gaze unrelenting. I kept working, trying to ignore him, but my heart began to race. Finally, he turned and walked away. Relief washed over me. I quickly finished the room and moved to the next one across the hall. As I was stripping the bed, his voice came again, closer this time. "Aren't you scared to do this job?" I froze, my hands clutching the sheets. He was standing in the doorway again, his massive frame blocking most of the light. "No," I said, trying to sound casual. "Not really. I don't interact with guests much." "You should be," he said, his tone sharp and ominous. "A girl like you, all alone. You need mace. A weapon." I laughed nervously, pulling my car keys from my pocket and jingling them. "These work well enough." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Not good enough," he said, taking a step closer. "You're small. Someone could snatch you up easily." My throat tightened. I managed a shaky, "Thanks for the advice," before darting into the bathroom to collect myself. My pulse pounded in my ears. After a few moments, I heard his door close. I peeked out, relieved to see the hallway empty, but the feeling of unease stayed with me. I left the room and went into one further down the hall, locking the door behind me. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone, considering whether to call my manager. Was I overreacting? He hadn't threatened me outright, had he? But his words repeated in my mind. "You're small. Someone could snatch you up easily." I stayed in that locked room for the next hour, unable to focus on cleaning. My manager eventually found me there, tears streaking my face as I tried to catch my breath. I told her everything. She took my concerns seriously, walking me out of the hallway and finishing my tasks herself. I was allowed to leave early that day, but the man's words stayed with me long after I left. Every time I returned to that hallway, I felt his presence, as though he were still watching from the shadows. The room behind the curtain. It had been a quiet start to the day at the hotel, the kind of quiet that always felt a little too still, like the air was holding its breath. I had been working as a healthcare assistant for a while, living in a small detached rental far away from my dad's home. It was a lonely stretch of countryside with just one neighbor, Jake. Jake had helped me move in when I first arrived. He was in his late 30s, always polite, always smiling, always present. Too present. At first I appreciated his friendliness. Living alone, it was nice to have someone to chat with. We bonded over music, and he often stopped by to talk about our shared love of Tool and playing bass. But it wasn't long before Jake's visits began to feel less like friendly neighborly chats and more like intrusions. One evening, I came home to find a basket of flowers on my doorstep. It was a thoughtful gesture, or so I thought. Attached was a card. From Jake. Hope you like them. Come by to say hi. That same night, there was a knock at my door. It was Jake. I wanted to see if you liked the flowers, he said, his voice soft but persistent. They're lovely, thank you, I replied, keeping my hand firmly on the doorframe. He lingered there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Do you have a minute? I thought maybe we could talk. I hesitated. It was late, and something about his demeanor put me on edge. I'm really tired, I said finally. Maybe tomorrow? His smile faltered just for a second, but the flash of something darker in his eyes made my stomach churn. Sure, he said, stepping back. Tomorrow, then. The next morning, he was waiting for me outside my door. Coffee? He asked, holding up 2 cups like a peace offering. I reluctantly agreed, figuring it was better to keep things polite. We walked to a nearby cafe, and as we sipped our drinks, Jake's demeanor shifted again. I like you, he blurted out suddenly. I mean, I really like you. I froze, unsure how to respond. That's sweet, I said cautiously. But I'm not looking for a relationship. His expression hardened. For a moment, I thought he might snap right there in the middle of the cafe. But instead, he muttered something under his breath, grabbed his cup, and left without another word. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. That night I came home to find him sitting on my doorstep. Jake, I said firmly, what are you doing here? I wanted to talk, he replied, standing as I approached. I think you owe me an explanation. I don't owe you anything, I said, my voice shaking. You need to leave. His face twisted into a sneer. You're just like the rest of them, he spat. Ungrateful, selfish. Fear prickled at the back of my neck as I stepped backward, fumbling for my keys. Leave, Jake, I repeated, trying to sound braver than I felt. He didn't move. I managed to unlock the door and slip inside, slamming it shut just as he stepped forward. Through the peephole, I saw him standing there, his fists clenched at his sides. The harassment escalated after that. Flowers and notes left on my doorstep. Phone calls at all hours of the night. I even caught him waiting for me in the parking lot at work. Each time, I told him to stop. Each time, he ignored me. One night, I woke up to a noise in the kitchen. My heart raced as I reached for my phone. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. I barely had time to react before a shadowy figure appeared in my doorway. It was Jake. I froze, my mind scrambling for a plan. He stood there, his face partially obscured by the darkness, but I could see the glint of something in his hand. Jake, I whispered, my voice trembling. You need to leave. He took a step closer and I bolted. I grabbed my phone and climbed out the window, sprinting barefoot across the lawn to my car. As I drove away, I looked back and saw him standing in the kitchen window, watching me with a sinister grin. The police found no signs of forced entry, and Jake denied everything. Without concrete evidence, they couldn't do much. But that night was enough for me. I packed my things and moved back in with my dad the next day. I still don't know how Jake got inside that night, but sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, certain that I hear footsteps just outside my bedroom door. The horse ranch of nowhere. The Caribbean sun beat down on the vibrant streets of Aruba as my wife and I strolled along, hand in hand, savoring the warm air and the freedom of our honeymoon. The days were idyllic. Our mornings spent lounging on white sand beaches, and our afternoons wandering through downtown, where the rhythm of calypso music floated from every corner. We were in paradise. On our third day, we saw the sign. It hung just outside one of the larger hotels, its bold letters advertising free horseback riding excursions. A catch, of course. There always was one. To earn the vouchers, we'd have to sit through a timeshare presentation. My wife and I exchanged a glance, then shrugged. It was a small price to pay for an experience we'd never forget. Or so we thought. The timeshare presentation was as tedious as expected, full of glossy brochures and pushy salespeople. But true to their word, they handed us 2 vouchers as we walked out the door, the promise of an adventure waiting on the horizon. The day of the excursion arrived, and we stood outside our hotel, waiting for the company's van to pick us up. When it pulled in, I felt the first pang of unease. It was old, battered and scratched, with faded paint peeling from its sides. The driver stepped out, his weathered face breaking into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You ready?" he asked, motioning us inside. As we climbed into the van, I couldn't help but notice the state of the interior. The upholstery was torn, the dashboard lit up with warning lights, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. My wife caught my eye, her expression mirroring my hesitation. But we were already inside, and the driver was pulling out of the lot. The drive took us far from the bustling tourist areas, the paved roads giving way to dirt paths. Civilization faded behind us, replaced by stretches of barren land and clusters of cacti. The van rattled violently with every bump, the engine groaning as if it might give out at any moment. After nearly an hour, we arrived at the so-called ranch. It wasn't what I'd pictured. There was no welcoming sign, no horses grazing in the distance, just an empty clearing with a small, dilapidated house and a shed that looked ready to collapse. "Where are the other riders?" my wife asked as we stepped out of the van. "It's just you 2 today," the driver said, his grin widening. "Private tour." A chill ran down my spine. The solitude of the place, once appealing, now felt suffocating. The man led us to the shed, motioning for us to wait while he got everything ready. As he disappeared around the corner, I peered into the shed. My stomach dropped. It was empty. "Where are the horses?" I whispered to my wife, trying to keep my voice steady. She shook her head, her unease now matching my own. "I don't know, but we need to leave." The man returned a moment later, his hands in his pockets. "You ready?" he asked. "Actually," I said quickly, "my wife isn't feeling well. We should head back." His smile faltered, and for a moment, his eyes darkened. Then he shrugged. "Sure, no problem. Let's get you back in the van." Relief washed over me as we climbed into the vehicle, but when he turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. "Out of gas," he muttered, shaking his head. He pulled out a cell phone and began speaking rapidly in Spanish, his tone growing more agitated with each word. "What's he saying?" my wife whispered. I didn't know, but every fiber of my being screamed at me to get out of that van. "We're walking back," I said, grabbing her hand. The man stopped mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing. "It's a long way," he said, his voice carrying an edge. "You're better off waiting. Someone's coming with gas." "We'll be fine," I replied firmly. stepping out of the van. My wife and I started down the dirt road, our pace quickening with every step. I could feel his eyes on us, watching as we disappeared over the horizon. The walk back was grueling. The heat bore down on us, and the road stretched endlessly ahead. We had no idea where we were going, only that we needed to put as much distance as possible between us and the ranch. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon a small house. A man sat on the porch, a taxi parked in the driveway. He looked up as we approached, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Can you take us back to the city?" I asked, desperation seeping into my voice. The man nodded, sensing the urgency in my tone. He didn't ask questions as we climbed into the taxi, and I was grateful for his silence. When we finally reached our hotel, I felt a weight lift from my chest. We reported the incident to the front desk, only to be met with indifference. "We don't work with that company," the clerk said with a shrug. "That's why we recommend booking through us." That night, as we lay in bed, my wife turned to me. "What do you think they were planning?" she asked. I didn't have an answer, but the thought haunted me. Had we narrowly escaped something sinister? Was the gas really out, or had it been part of some twisted plan? We left Aruba 2 days later, the memory of the ranch lingering like a shadow. To this day, I can't think about that trip without feeling a shiver of unease. The longest walk. It was supposed to be a peaceful afternoon. My cousin and I had set out on a walk to enjoy the summer breeze, leaving behind the commotion of a family gathering at my aunt's house. The air was warm, the kind of sticky humidity that clings to your skin, but the shaded sidewalks offered some relief. I was only 12 or 13 at the time, with my cousin a few years older at 16. I always looked up to her, trusting her to guide me when things felt uncertain. The plan was simple. No destination, just wandering. As we strolled along the residential streets, her idea shifted. "Let's walk to Aunt Maria's apartment. It's just a little further." I hesitated. Something about the idea didn't sit right with me. The sun was already starting to dip, and Aunt Maria's place was in a different neighborhood entirely. But my cousin brushed off my concern, saying we'd be fine. She was older, wiser, and I wanted to believe her. So we kept walking. Block after block, the houses thinned out, replaced by empty lots and patches of overgrown grass. The air seemed heavier, the streets quieter. By the time we crossed a small bridge overlooking a narrow creek, the sun was a vibrant orange smear on the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows. As we paused to catch our breath, a man appeared. He was at the far end of the street, just a vague figure at first, blending into the dimming light. I wouldn't have thought twice about him if he hadn't stopped dead in his tracks and turned toward us. "Hey!" His voice boomed, shattering the stillness. It wasn't a friendly greeting. It was sharp, commanding. He raised his arm, pointing straight at us. "You!" My cousin and I froze, exchanging panicked glances. Then, as if on cue, the man began sprinting toward us. Not walking, not jogging, sprinting. "Run!" my cousin screamed, grabbing my arm. The adrenaline hit instantly. My legs burned as we bolted down the street, weaving around parked cars and trash bins. The sound of his heavy footsteps echoed behind us, growing louder with each passing second. He was fast, impossibly fast, and gaining on us. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. His face was twisted in a sickening mix of rage and determination, his arms pumping furiously. My cousin yanked me toward a side street. "This way," she panted. The turn bought us a few seconds, but the man wasn't far behind. The neighborhood was a labyrinth of narrow alleys and overgrown yards, and every shadow felt like it could hide another threat. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. As we rounded another corner, we saw it. Aunt Maria's apartment complex. It was just a block away, its pale brick walls and flickering porch lights like a beacon of safety. But we weren't there yet. "We're almost there," my cousin gasped, her grip on my wrist tightening. We darted across the street, nearly tripping over a cracked section of sidewalk. My lungs burned. My legs screamed for rest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The man's footsteps were deafening now. So close, I swore I could feel his breath on the back of my neck. We reached the apartment gate, my cousin fumbling with the latch as I kept watch. The man was still there, standing at the corner, his chest heaving. His eyes were wild, scanning the area like a predator searching for its prey. Then he stepped forward. "Get in!" my cousin hissed, finally managing to open the gate. We scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind us. There was no lock, no real barrier between us and him, but it was something. We crouched behind a cluster of bushes near the apartment's front steps, holding our breath. The man approached the gate, his footsteps slow and deliberate now. He reached out, gripping the metal bars. His fingers curled around them tightly, the veins in his hands bulging. He stared directly into the yard, his eyes scanning the shadows. I thought I was going to throw up. Seconds dragged into minutes as we stayed perfectly still, afraid that even the slightest movement would give us away. Finally, the man muttered something under his breath and turned back toward the street. He walked away slowly at first, then picked up speed until he disappeared around the corner. We didn't move. Not until we were absolutely certain he was gone. Even then, it took every ounce of courage to stand up and knock on Aunt Maria's door. When she answered, she took one look at our pale faces and trembling bodies and pulled us inside without a word. We tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled, incoherent. All we could do was sit there, clutching each other, as the reality of what we'd just escaped sank in. To this day, I don't know what that man wanted or why he chased us so relentlessly. But I'll never forget the sound of his footsteps or the look in his eyes when he reached that gate. It's a memory that lingers in the back of my mind, a reminder that danger can find you even in the quietest corners of the world. The silent passenger. It was a long, monotonous drive along the I-10. The kind of drive where the road stretches endlessly before you, and the landscape blurs into a repetitive pattern of trees, fields, and the occasional billboard. I was on my way back from visiting family, my car packed with little more than a duffel bag, some snacks, and a playlist I had played one too many times. The drive should have been uneventful. It should have been forgettable. But instead, it became something I'll never be able to forget. I first noticed the Prius when it slid into my blind spot. It was an unremarkable car, a pale silver gray that seemed to blend into the haze of the highway. I didn't think much of it at first. People drive in your blind spot all the time, right? But as the miles ticked by, the Prius stayed exactly where it was. It didn't pass me, didn't fall back, just lingered there. After a while, I started to feel uneasy. I slowed down slightly, expecting the Prius to overtake me. Instead, it matched my speed, staying stubbornly at my side. I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us. Again, it matched me. I glanced over, trying to catch a glimpse of the driver. The windows were tinted just dark enough to obscure whoever was inside. I couldn't see a thing. The car itself looked clean but lived in. The kind of car you'd expect a commuter to have. But something about its behavior was off. I decided to try another tactic. I eased into the right lane, preparing to exit at the next ramp. The Prius followed. My unease turned into outright alarm. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. Whoever was driving that car was tailing me. I got off the freeway and pulled into a gas station, hoping they would drive past. But as I parked at the pump and got out of my car, I saw the Prius glide into the lot, parking at the far end. The engine idled, the car facing me like a predator sizing up its prey. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the gas pump. I couldn't stay here, exposed, with nothing but a thin stretch of asphalt between me and that car. I filled the tank as quickly as I could, avoiding eye contact with the darkened windows of the Prius. When I climbed back into my car, I felt the weight of its gaze on me. I pulled out of the lot and back onto the road, my heart pounding in my chest. The Prius followed. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that I was overreacting. Maybe they just happened to be going the same way. Maybe it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel the intensity of their attention, like a physical presence pressing down on me. The miles stretched on and the Prius stayed with me. It didn't matter if I sped up or slowed down, if I switched lanes or took detours. It was always there, a silent, unyielding shadow. Finally, I decided to confront them. I maneuvered my car to force them into the left lane beside me, where I could get a clear look at them. As I glanced over, my breath caught in my throat. There were two people in the car, a man in the passenger seat and a woman behind the wheel. They both stared at me, their expressions twisted into something I can only describe as hatred. The man's eyes were wild, his lips curled into a sneer. He made a gesture, tapping his temple with one finger before drawing it across his throat in a slow, deliberate motion. I felt a surge of icy fear. Whoever these people were, they weren't just following me. They were targeting me. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, pushing my car to its limits. The engine roared as I shot down the highway, weaving between cars and trying to put as much distance as possible between me and the Prius. For a while, I thought I had lost them. Then I saw them again. They were waiting on the shoulder of the road, their car positioned to merge seamlessly into traffic as I passed. My stomach twisted into knots as they pulled out behind me, closing the gap in seconds. I couldn't do this anymore. I needed help. I spotted an upcoming exit with a rest area and veered toward it. The Prius didn't follow this time. Instead, it sped past, disappearing into the night. I pulled into the rest area and parked near the entrance, where the lot was brightly lit and several trucks were parked. For a long time I just sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my eyes scanning every car that passed. I waited, half expecting the Prius to appear again, but it never did. Eventually, I got back on the road, my nerves frayed, but my determination to get home stronger than ever. I didn't see the Prius again for the rest of the drive, but the memory of those two faces, their eyes filled with malice, stayed with me. Even now, years later, I can't help but glance over my shoulder every time I see a silver Prius on the road. It's a reminder that some dangers don't announce themselves with fanfare. They linger in the shadows, silent and persistent, until the moment they decide to strike.